The first time I walked the full perimeter of my 50 acres, I found the spring by accident. I'd been following the fence line on the eastern edge of the property, checking posts and looking for damage, when I heard it. That particular sound water makes when it's moving over stone. Not the rush of a creek, but something quieter, more deliberate. I pushed through a stand of cedar trees and there it was. Clear water welling up from a crack in the limestone bedrock, pooling in a natural basin about 6 feet across before spilling over and running downhill in a channel that looked like it had been there for centuries. The water was cold enough to make my hand ache when I tested it. Clean. What, the kind of spring that had probably drawn people to this land long before anyone thought to divide it into parcels and file deeds at the county courthouse. The realtor hadn't mentioned it. The previous owner's estate sale documents listed the property as wooded acreage with seasonal creek, which was technically true, but missed the point entirely. This wasn't seasonal. This was the source. I stood there for a while watching the water move, thinking about what it meant to own something like this. Not just the land, but the water that came out of it. In this part of the state, water rights weren't some abstract legal concept. They were the difference between a property you could use and one you couldn't. The spring put out a steady flow. I'd later learn it was roughly 40 gallons per minute, even in the dry months, and enough to supply a household with plenty left over, enough to irrigate, enough to matter. I bought the property in late March. The previous owner had died without heirs, and the estate wanted it gone. I paid cash, closed in 2 weeks, and spent the first month just learning the land. Where the deer moved at dawn, which sections turned to mud when it rained, where the property lines actually were versus where I'd assumed they'd be based on the survey map. That's when I found the pipeline. I was walking the southern boundary, the section that ran closest to the HOA community I could see through the trees. New construction, maybe 5 years old, 200 homes on quarter-acre lots, all identical vinyl siding and HOA-mandated earth tones. The kind of place where someone would send you a violation notice for parking your truck on the street overnight. The pipeline was black PVC, 4 inches in diameter, running through a shallow trench that someone had tried to disguise with leaf litter and fallen branches. It crossed my property line about 40 yards from the spring, heading directly toward it. I followed it uphill. It terminated at the spring itself, with a professional intake assembly bolted into the limestone. Someone had done real work here. Concrete anchors, a filter screen, a valve assembly that let them control the flow. All of it on my land. None of it with my permission. I stood there looking at it for a long time, trying to understand the logic, trying to imagine the conversation where someone decided this was acceptable. The previous owner had been elderly, living alone, rarely on the property in his final years. Maybe they'd asked him and he'd said yes. Maybe they'd just done it and he'd never noticed. Either way, he was gone now. And I was here. I took photographs, checked the survey markers to confirm I was well within my boundaries, walked the pipeline route all the way to where it crossed onto HOA property, disappearing underground near their retention pond. Then I went home and started making phone calls. The surveyor's report sat on my kitchen table for 3 days before I could bring myself to read it again. I kept hoping I'd misunderstood something, that the bright red line marking the pipeline's route across my property would somehow shift, would reveal itself to be on the other side of the boundary markers. It didn't. The pipeline entered my land at the northwestern corner. You ran diagonally for nearly 800 feet and connected directly to the spring before continuing east toward the HOA development. The report included photographs, close-ups of the PVC piping, partially buried but visible where erosion had exposed it, timestamps on the images, GPS coordinates that placed every inch of it on my side of the property line. I called the county records office first, 20 minutes on hold, then another 15 explaining what I needed. The clerk searched for any registered easements, water rights agreements, or utility permissions associated with my parcel number. Nothing. Are you sure? I asked. I'm looking at the file right now, she said. Last recorded easement was in 1987 for a rural electric cooperative line. Nothing since then, nothing about water. I thanked her and hung up. The HOA management office was listed online with a local address and a phone number that rang 4 times before someone picked up. A woman's voice, professionally pleasant. I explained who I was, that I'd recently purchased the property adjacent to their community, and that I needed to speak with someone about a water pipeline. "Oh, you're the new owner," she said. Her tone shifted slightly. Not unfriendly, but careful. "Let me transfer you to our board president." The hold music was classical, something with violins. "This is Richard Pemberton." The voice was clipped, efficient. The voice of a man who chaired meetings and expected his calls returned promptly. I introduced myself again and described what the surveyor had found. "Yes, that's our community water line," he said, as if I'd asked him to confirm the weather. It connects to the spring on the ridge. Has for years." "It's on my property," I said. "Well, it's been there since before you bought the place." "That doesn't make it legal." There was a pause. Not long. Just enough for me to hear him shift in his chair. "The previous owner never had an issue with it," Pemberton said. "Mr. Carver understood that the community relied on that water source. He was a reasonable man. Mr. Carver passed away. I own the property now." "Look," Pemberton said, and now there was an edge in his voice. "That water source has always served this community. We have 200 homes here, families. You can't just cut us off." "I'm not trying to cut anyone off. I'm trying to understand why there's infrastructure on my land without my permission. It's been there for years. Do you have an easement?" Another pause. Longer this time. "We have an understanding," he said. "An understanding isn't a legal document." "Mr. Carver isn't here anymore," I said. "I am, and I need to see documentation for any pipeline crossing my property. Easement agreements, water rights, anything." Pemberton exhaled slowly. "I'll have our management company pull the files. But I'm telling you right now, you're making a problem where there isn't one. That pipeline serves essential needs for this community. You should feel privileged to be part of that." Privileged. I looked out the window at the fence line, at the hills beyond where the HOA's identical rooftops rose in neat rows. I'll expect those documents by the end of the week," I said. "You're going to regret making this difficult," Pemberton said. "Bad neighborly conduct doesn't go unnoticed around here." He hung up before I could respond. The email arrived at 6:47 a.m., 3 days after I'd sent my certified letter to the HOA board documenting the unauthorized pipeline and requesting an immediate meeting. I was drinking coffee on my back porch when my phone buzzed. The subject line read, "Property boundary issue. Response from Meadowbrook HOA board." Property boundary issue. As if I'd complained about a fence being 2 inches over the line. I opened it. The tone hit me before the content did. There was no greeting, no acknowledgement of the legal documentation I'd provided, or just 3 paragraphs that managed to be both dismissive and vaguely threatening. The water source in question has served the Meadowbrook community for over 15 years. The previous property owner had a long-standing informal agreement with our community and never raised objections to our water infrastructure. We find your sudden demands concerning and inconsistent with the spirit of good neighborly relations that defines our area. I read it again. Informal agreement. They were claiming an arrangement that had never been documented, never been signed, never been compensated. An arrangement with a man who'd been dead for 2 years before I bought the property. The second paragraph was worse. Our legal counsel has advised us that continuous use of a resource over an extended period can establish certain rights under prescriptive easement doctrine. We are confident that any legal challenge you pursue will ultimately recognize the community's legitimate claim to this water source. We strongly encourage you to reconsider any actions that might disrupt service to 200 families. I set my coffee down. My hand had started shaking, and not from caffeine. They were threatening me. Politely, carefully, wrapped in legal terminology, but threatening me nonetheless. They'd consulted an attorney not to negotiate, but to find a way to justify what they'd already done. The final paragraph was the kicker. That said, we recognize your position as the new property owner and want to maintain positive community relations. We are prepared to offer you an honorary membership in the Meadowbrook HOA, including access to our community amenities, as a gesture of goodwill for your continued cooperation with our water infrastructure. We trust this resolves the matter amicably. I actually laughed. A short, sharp sound that startled the birds from the nearby trees. An honorary HOA membership, access to their tennis courts and their community pool. That was their offer for unlimited access to my water, for a pipeline they'd installed without permission, for a resource they were selling to their residents through monthly HOA fees while paying me nothing. I forwarded the email to my attorney with a single line. I think we're past the friendly negotiation stage. She called me within the hour. They're bluffing about the prescriptive easement, she said after I'd read her the full email. 15 years isn't enough in this state, and they'd need to prove the previous owner knew about it and explicitly allowed it. Do you have any documentation from the estate sale? Everything. The previous owner's family had no idea about any water arrangement. They would have mentioned it. Good, because what the HOA doesn't seem to understand is that they've just put their position in writing. They've admitted there was no formal agreement, no documentation, no compensation. They've admitted they're relying on an informal arrangement with someone who can't testify to it. She paused. I could hear papers shuffling. How do you want to proceed? I looked out at my land. At the spring, I could see from the porch, more water bubbling up clear and cold from the limestone below. At the pipeline I hadn't installed, hadn't authorized, hadn't been paid for. Draft a formal offer, I said. Fair terms, documented easement, reasonable compensation, and if they reject it, we move to have that pipeline removed. They're not going to like that. I don't think they like me much already. The attorney's office smelled like old books and furniture polish. Marcus Webb sat across from me, a stack of property documents spread between us like evidence at a trial. He'd spent the last hour walking me through what I already suspected, but needed confirmed in legal terms. It's cut and dry, he said, tapping the survey map. The spring originates here, entirely within your property boundaries. No recorded easements. The no prescriptive rights established because the previous owner's permission, if it even existed, died with him. Legally, they're trespassing and stealing your water. I watched him trace the pipeline's route with his finger. 300 feet of unauthorized infrastructure cutting across land I owned. What are my options? Marcus leaned back in his chair. You can have it removed immediately, sue for damages, file criminal trespassing charges if you want to be aggressive about it. He paused. Or you can negotiate an easement agreement, get compensated for what they're taking. The second option felt right. I wasn't interested in destroying a community over bureaucratic incompetence. But I also wasn't going to let 200 households treat my property like a public utility. But what's fair compensation look like? He pulled out a calculator and started running numbers. Water usage for 200 homes. Market rates for water rights in the county. The value of the easement itself. When he finished, he slid the paper across the desk. I'd recommend $500 monthly. That's roughly $250 per household if they split it evenly. Reasonable by any standard. You could ask for more, probably get it. But this keeps you in the realm of neighborly rather than punitive. I looked at the number, $6,000 annually for something they'd been taking for free. It felt almost too modest. Draw up the agreement, I said. Marcus spent the next week crafting the easement proposal. It was professional, thorough, and more than fair. 30-year term, $500 monthly, annual adjustments for inflation, maintenance responsibilities clearly defined. Either party could terminate with proper notice, but the HOA would be required to remove their infrastructure at their own expense if they walked away. I delivered it personally to Patricia's office at the HOA Community Center. She took the envelope like it might contain anthrax. What's this? A solution. Easement agreement for the water pipeline. $500 a month. Works out to about $250 per household. She didn't open it, just set it on her desk with 2 fingers, as if minimizing contact. We'll review it with the board. It's a fair offer, Patricia. Probably more fair than you deserve given the circumstances. Her expression hardened. We'll be in touch. I left knowing exactly how this would go. The board would see the monthly fee and lose their minds. They'd convince themselves I was the problem, not their years of unauthorized use. They'd reject it out of principle, out of pride, out of some twisted sense that they were entitled to what they'd been stealing. 2 weeks later, the response came. Not a phone call, not a meeting. A formal letter on HOA letterhead, signed by all 5 board members. The words were dressed up in legal language, but the message was simple. They refused the easement. They called my terms unconscionable and extortionate. They suggested I was attempting to hold the community hostage and warned that they would pursue all available legal remedies if I interfered with their water access. The letter ended with a threat barely disguised as advice. We strongly encourage you to reconsider this hostile position before taking any action you may regret. I read it twice, then set it on my kitchen table next to Marcus Webb's business card. They'd made their choice. Now I'd make mine. The email arrived at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, and I knew before opening it that the HOA board had made their decision. The subject line read, RE, Proposed Easement Terms, Final Response. I poured my coffee and sat down at the kitchen table. Through the window, I could see the morning sun catching the surface of the spring, the water moving in that slow, ancient rhythm it had kept for centuries before any of us arrived, before the pipeline, before the HOA, before the assumption that what had always been would always continue to be. The email was 3 paragraphs long. The first paragraph rejected my offer outright. $500 per month was, according to HOA President Patricia Hendricks, grossly excessive and entirely unreasonable for a resource that has served this community without incident for over 15 years. The second paragraph informed me that the board had consulted with their attorney, finally, some legal advice on their end, who had apparently suggested that my claim to the water might be questionable given the established usage pattern. They were considering adverse possession arguments, prescriptive easements, and something about implied consent through the previous owner's silence. The third paragraph was where things got personal. Your attempt to extract payment for water access that has been freely provided for years constitutes extortion and bad faith negotiation. The board views your demands as a transparent money grab from a community of hard-working families. We will not be bullied into paying for something we have every right to access. Consider this matter closed. I read it twice. Then I forwarded it to my attorney with a single line. They said no. Please proceed with next steps. His response came back within the hour. Expected. Sending formal notice today. Pipeline removal can begin once notice period expires. 7 days per statute. I should have felt angry. Instead, I felt something closer to disappointment. Not in them. I'd stopped expecting reason from the HOA board 3 weeks ago. Disappointment in the waste of it all. The unnecessary conflict. Yeah, the money they were about to spend that they didn't have to spend. $250 per house. That's what I'd asked for. Less than a streaming service subscription. Less than a tank of gas. For water that came from my land, through my spring. Extracted without my permission. And they'd called it extortion. I walked outside and followed the fence line down to where the pipeline emerged from the ground. The excavation had been professional. I'd give them that. Clean cuts, proper depth. quality materials. Someone had spent real money installing this system. Someone had made decisions, signed contracts, paid invoices. At no point had anyone thought to ask the landowner's permission. My phone rang. Patricia Hendricks. I almost didn't answer. Then I thought about the conversation I'd have to recount later. Be the he said, she said, that would matter if this ended up in court. I hit record on my phone's voice memo app and answered. Mr. Chen, I'm calling to see if we can discuss this situation like reasonable adults. I thought the matter was closed, I said. That's what your email said. I'm trying to extend an olive branch here. The board is willing to consider a nominal administrative fee for the easement. Say, $50 per month. That's more than fair for something that costs you nothing. The pipeline comes off my property in 7 days, I said. You'll receive formal notice this afternoon. You can't do that. You'll be cutting off water to 200 families. You cut off negotiations when you called me an extortionist, I said. My offer was fair. You rejected it. And now we proceed according to my property rights. The line went quiet for a long moment. You're going to regret this, she said. No, I said. I don't think I will. The certified letter from my attorney arrived at the HOA office on a Monday morning. By Monday afternoon, my phone was ringing off the hook. I didn't answer. Tuesday morning, I met the excavation crew at the eastern boundary of my property, where the pipeline crossed onto my land. The crew chief, a weathered man named Ron who'd seen every kind of property dispute in his 30 years, walked the line with me first. You're sure about this? He asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. I gave them every chance to do this the right way. He nodded slowly. I've worked for that HOA before. They're not good people to deal with. The excavator's diesel engine coughed to life just after 8. The sound carried across the valley, and I wondered if anyone in the development could hear it. I wondered if they understood what it meant. Ron's crew worked with surgical precision. They exposed the pipeline at the property line, cut it clean, and capped both ends. The section on my land would be removed entirely. The section on theirs would terminate at the boundary, flowing into nothing. It took less than 4 hours. By noon, I'd reinforced the fence line with new posts and added security cameras at 3 points along the eastern boundary. The signs went up last. Private property. No trespassing. Violators will be prosecuted. My phone showed 43 missed calls. The first email from the HOA's attorney arrived at 2:15. It threatened legal action for disruption of essential services and endangering public health and safety. I forwarded it to my attorney with a single line. They're panicking. His response came back in minutes. Let them panic. They have no legal ground to stand on. That evening, I drove past the HOA entrance on my way into town. A cluster of residents had gathered near the community center. Even from the road, I could see the tension in their postures, the animated gestures of people who just realized their normal had been built on someone else's property. A white pickup truck followed me for 2 miles before turning off. I recognized it from the HOA board meetings I'd attended. They were watching me now, as if surveillance would somehow restore their water pressure. Wednesday brought a different kind of communication. A handwritten note appeared in my mailbox, though my property was gated and the mailbox was a 1/4 mile from the road. Someone had walked onto my land to deliver it. You're hurting families, it read. Children and elderly people need that water. This is cruel. I photographed the note and the envelope, then called the sheriff's office to report the trespassing. The deputy who took the report was sympathetic, but unsurprised. We've been getting calls from that development all week, he said. Lot of angry people looking for someone to blame. They can blame their board, I said. I'm just protecting what's mine. By Thursday, the HOA had hired emergency water delivery services. I watched the trucks rumble past my gate every morning, hauling thousands of gallons to fill the community's reserves. Each truck represented money hemorrhaging from their budget, costs they'd never anticipated, because they'd never imagined someone would enforce their property rights. The drilling equipment arrived Friday. I could see the rig from my western ridge, a tall metal skeleton rising above the development's roofline. They were going to drill their own wells, finally doing what they should have done years ago instead of stealing from my land. I estimated the cost at somewhere north of $300,000, all because they'd called a reasonable offer extortion. My attorney called that evening with news. The HOA had filed for an emergency injunction to force me to restore water access. The hearing was set for the following Tuesday. "Let them come," I said. "I'll bring the survey maps and the photos of their pipeline on my property. Let a judge decide who's in the wrong here." The first call came on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after I'd removed the pipeline. I was having coffee on my porch when my phone lit up with a number I didn't recognize. I let it go to voicemail. Then another call. And another. By noon, I had 17 missed calls and a voicemail box so full it stopped accepting new messages. I finally listened to one. A woman's voice, strained and angry. "This is Rebecca Chen from Meadowbrook. Our water pressure is almost nothing. My husband can't shower before work. Do you have any idea what you've done to this community?" I deleted it, then the next one, and the next. What I'd done was enforce my property rights. What they'd done was steal from me for years and then call me an extortionist when I asked for fair compensation. The consequences were not my problem, but I heard about them anyway. Small towns talk, and the Meadowbrook water crisis became the only topic worth discussing at the hardware store, the gas station, the diner on Route 9. The HOA had hired an emergency drilling company within days of losing access to my spring. I'd seen the trucks rumbling past my property line, heavy equipment that tore up the common areas near the community center. They drilled 3 wells in 2 weeks, working around the clock. None of them produced enough water. The first well hit rock at 180 feet. The second found water, but it came up rust-colored and smelling of sulfur. The third produced maybe 30 gallons per minute, barely a fifth of what my spring had been giving them for free. The drilling company's invoice, according to my attorney, who had sources on the new interim board, came to $285,000. For water that didn't work. Meadowbrook instituted mandatory water restrictions. No lawn watering, no car washing, showers limited to 5 minutes. The community pool, their pride and joy, sat empty and gathering leaves. I heard that Karen Westfield tried to organize a protest at my front gate. She managed to recruit 11 people. They stood there for 40 minutes holding signs about community values and neighborly responsibility before the sheriff's deputy I'd called sent them away for trespassing on the county road easement. The lawsuit came next, though not the one they probably wanted, and 7 homeowners filed against the HOA board for gross mismanagement and breach of fiduciary duty. The complaint, which became public record, outlined everything: the unauthorized pipeline, the rejected easement offer, the refusal to negotiate, the catastrophic drilling costs. Christine Morrison's name appeared on every page. Property values started dropping almost immediately. 3 homes went up for sale in the first month. Then 6 more. No one wanted to buy into a community with a water crisis and an HOA facing massive litigation. The recall petition gathered 140 signatures in 8 days. I watched it all from my porch, drinking water from my spring. Cold, clear, unlimited water that bubbled up from the ground at 200 gallons per minute, every hour, every day. The same water that could have been theirs for $500 a month. Christine Morrison resigned on a Thursday. The vice president and treasurer followed within 48 hours. The entire board gone, replaced by an interim committee that had exactly one mandate from the community: fix this. My attorney called that Friday evening. "They want to talk," he said. "I'm sure they do. Different people this time, reasonable people. They're asking if you'd be willing to meet." I looked out at my land, at the fence line I'd reinforced, at the spring that kept flowing regardless of who thought they deserved it. "Tell them I'll listen," I said, once. 3 months had passed since I'd cut off their water supply, and the transformation was complete. But the HOA community that had once dismissed me as an inconvenient property owner now understood exactly what their arrogance had cost them. The new board president, a retired engineer named Margaret Chen, who'd replaced the disgraced former leadership, sat across from me at my kitchen table. She'd requested this meeting personally, and unlike her predecessor, she'd come alone, without lawyers flanking her like bodyguards. "I want to start by apologizing," she said, sliding a folder across the table. "What the previous board did was inexcusable. We've reviewed all the documentation, and there's no question you were wronged." Inside the folder was everything I'd asked for 3 months ago, and more. The settlement agreement included the $50,000 for past water usage, the 30-year easement at $750 monthly, and full coverage of my legal fees. They'd even added a clause guaranteeing my water rights in perpetuity, something my attorney had suggested, but I hadn't insisted on. "The wells aren't working," Margaret admitted, her voice quiet. "The water quality is terrible, high in minerals, barely potable even with treatment, and the yield is a fraction of what we need. We're trucking in water twice a week just to keep up with demand." I'd heard about the water trucks. My nearest neighbor, old Jim Patterson, had mentioned seeing them rumbling through at dawn and dusk, each delivery costing the HOA thousands of dollars they hadn't budgeted for. "The previous board cost us everything," Margaret continued. $300,000 for the wells, another $100,000 in legal fees from the homeowner lawsuits. Property values have dropped 15% because buyers are terrified of the water situation. We've had 2 families move out already, and 5 more properties are listed. She looked tired. I understood that exhaustion, the weight of cleaning up someone else's catastrophic mistakes. "Your original offer was more than fair," she said. "We should have taken it. Instead, our pride cost this community nearly $500,000, destroyed property values, and created a crisis that's going to take years to fully resolve." I signed the settlement agreement. Not because I needed their apology, but because the terms were right. Fair compensation for fair access, the way it should have been from the beginning. "One more thing," Margaret said, in pulling out a second document. "We're implementing new policies. Any future infrastructure projects require independent legal review and property owner consent. We're also establishing a community fund specifically for situations like this. So if we ever need to negotiate access to private property again, we have resources set aside to do it properly." It was the kind of systematic change that only came from genuine institutional failure. They'd learned, but the tuition had been steep. After Margaret left, I walked out to the spring. The new pipeline, properly permitted, professionally installed, with shut-off valves I controlled, hummed quietly beside the old fence line. The water flowed clear and cold, the same as it had for generations, but now it flowed under terms that respected both the resource and the property owner. My phone buzzed. A message from my attorney. "Settlement funds cleared. Congratulations on standing your ground." I thought about the former HOA president, who'd called me unreasonable for asking $500 a month. That same arrogance had cost his community nearly $500,000, his reputation, and his position. All because he couldn't imagine that someone might actually enforce their property rights. The spring continued flowing, indifferent to human pride and human folly. But the people who depended on it had finally learned what I'd tried to teach them from the beginning. Respect costs nothing, but disrespect costs everything.